Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Peter Cleary, and I'm joined by my colleagues Ian Chesney and Joanne McNamara. We are our Santis team that has been focused on a lot of federal affairs over this campaign. And we're pleased to come to you this morning to kind of walk through what we think happened and where we think things will head, specifically when it comes to healthcare. A couple housekeeping things. At the bottom of your screen, you can click on chat, and we would highly encourage, if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can hit that chat button and ask questions as we go. And we'll also save time at the end as well too, in order for you to be able to ask questions if you so choose, both verbally or over the chat function. So just to highlight who we are, and most of the people I think on this webinar probably know who we are. Ian and I work out of our Ottawa office. I've had quite a bit of experience working in both minority and majority governments, both in Ontario under Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, and then under Justin Trudeau in the first mandate. And Ian worked provincially in Ontario for the health minister there. And Joanne has a stellar career working in federal politics, working for both the minority and majority governments of the Stephen Harper government up in Ottawa. So what we want to walk through today is a little bit on the results, what the polls were saying and what actually happened, and then kind of do a good dive into what we think will happen when it comes to health policy, how the opposition will react, and then just our instincts and tips on how to engage a federal minority government. And before we get going, because Ian's going to dive into the results, but I was looking up some interesting stats this morning. It was actually Pierre Elliott Trudeau's second election resulted in minority government. He got 109 seats to Stanfield's PC's 107 seats. Interestingly, the next election that he got a minority government, Joe Clark actually won 136 with 35% of the vote, and Trudeau won a lesser number. He went into opposition with 40% of the vote. So I thought that was just kind of an interesting historical numbers to kind of kick off what the heck happened this election. And why don't, Ian, you kind of run through that?
Thanks, Peter. So just to set the context a bit, based on some previous polling we were seeing right before the election with respect to seat count. So what we have here were the CBC aggregate polls as of October 20th, so the day before the election. And as you can see, the polls were pretty much putting, the two major parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, in terms of the parties being the front runners in this election, pretty firmly in minority government territory. And that hadn't really changed that much, particularly in the last few weeks of the election. But again, this was starting to show the signs of likely a Liberal minority government coming through the election. Where we did see some changes in the last few weeks of the election were particularly with the Bloc Québécois in Quebec and the NDP, where they had started to make significant gains or potential projected gains in seat count. And then, of course, in terms of the results that we saw at the end of the night on October 21st, as predicted, the Liberals did come out with a minority government with 157 seats. The Conservatives in opposition, they're behind with 121 seats. And a Bloc Québécois now in as the official third party with 32 seats. And the NDP coming in at 24, which really demonstrates that the predictions, particularly with the NDP, were maybe a little off in that they didn't come out as strong through the election results. And we'll speak to that a little bit more later. And the Green Party only coming through with 3 seats, which again, similar to the NDP, a bit of where there have been previous projections at the beginning of the campaign that the Greens might pick up a significant number of seats, but those there was a bit of a fail to meet expectations there. On popular vote, the story's quite different, as we've been seeing in the media. Of course, the Conservatives came out ahead in the popular vote at 34.4%, with the Liberals shortly there behind, and the NDP in third place. So what we have here are the two electoral maps in terms of the difference between the 2015 election results and the 2019 election results. It's just interesting to see in this visual. At this level, they don't actually look all that different, of course, but when we drill down a bit, particularly to metropolitan areas or a little more drilled down into those kind of vote-rich provinces in the country, particularly Ontario and Quebec, obviously there's some real differences on the map. So, of course, a lot of Quebec now has gone to the Bloc Québécois, and the Liberals did lose their hold on a significant number of seats across the country. Of course, they lost every seat in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the Conservatives took every seat in those provinces, and there were significant losses in British Columbia, and some losses as well, of course, in the Maritimes and in Ontario as well.
I think what's interesting about looking at the map is that Liberal governments over the past 30 years have not really done well in Western Canada. If you look to Jean Chrétien's win in 1997, he won all the seats in Ontario, didn't fare particularly well at West. And if you look back to previous Liberal wins, the story can be similarly told. But what's really unique about this election is even under those governments, they still had seats out West, and there is not a Liberal seat between BC and Winnipeg, which will make a very challenging environment for the Trudeau government to appoint a cabinet that is truly representative of the entire country.
And so what we wanted to show here were a comparison in losses or gains on these next two slides among the two major parties. So we'll start with the Liberals. So this breaks down the share of the vote going back to the 2011 election under Ignatieff. Of course, that was the election where the Liberals went down to third-party status and lost a significant number of support across the country, and that's, of course, reflected in these numbers. There were gains, significant gains in the 2015 election, of course, as the Liberals tracked to a majority government. But you know what I think this tells here mostly is that, of course, while the Liberals did come out of this election with a minority government at 157 seats, they lost a significant number, particularly in some provinces, but they technically lost in every province across the country. And the story with the Conservatives, of course, comparing the 2015 election to the 2019 election, there were gains in almost every province. But in many provinces, they were marginal, and particularly in Ontario and Quebec, there technically were losses, of course, in vote share. And again, that goes back, to the fact that Ontario and Quebec are in a first past the post system in terms of voter efficiency. Those are very rich seats or rich provinces in the country, and that's where the Liberals were able to hang on to some seats in order to come out and form government. But these results did have their high-profile wins and losses, which really speaks to the volatility of this election and just how this campaign has played out over the last few weeks, and how close the races were in some ridings where it really came down to significant efforts on ground game that probably helped tip one party ahead of another. And so we've some of the high profiles. Of course, wins we saw were that the Conservatives won the popular vote, of course, but also swept every single seat in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And there were also but there were high-profile losses among all of the parties, whether it be former cabinet ministers that lost their seat, or star candidates that the parties were hoping would be able to come through and take votes away from the other parties. And of course, an interesting piece coming out of this election that is rather precedent-setting. It has happened before, but is an independent candidate winning her seat and returning to the House of Commons, namely Jody Wilson-Raybould. So what does this all mean? With these results, I mean, what we're really seeing is the voter efficiency element of a first past the post system playing out. So in terms of the vote-rich provinces, largely Ontario and Quebec, that is where Liberals were able to hold on to some seats. And in Ontario, they were able to hold on to a significant number of their support in the 905 area. And that was really what the election was coming down to, especially in the last week. We're also able to hold on to a significant number in Atlantic Canada, although there were some losses in that province, and key metropolitan areas in the east. So particularly, of course, areas like Toronto and Montreal. The strong Conservative vote in Western Canada really speaks to feelings of Western alienation in those provinces, but also speaks to the fact that that wasn't enough to tip the Conservatives into the win, speaks to the voter inefficiency in a first past the post system, particularly in those provinces. Of course, we had a resurgence of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. That was something that kind of came out, particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the election campaign, and now they've been able to return to previous status and have third-party status, and that will be interesting to see how that plays out as a voice specifically for Quebec in a minority government. And also, of course, the dissatisfaction with the NDP, which that had kind of been long predicted over the last few months and demonstrated through the polls. But we did see some growth, particularly in the leader's popularity among millennials. And so time will tell if that popularity continues to grow and maybe helps the party gain support going forward. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Peter to talk a bit more about the Liberal health agenda and the implications in a minority government.
Cool. Quick summary, 2015 to 2019, the government record largely around funding transfers to provinces to support mental health and addictions, home and community care. That's the health accord, the $5 billion for home care and $6 billion for mental health. And that is last 10 years. So we have another 6 years of funding arrangements for provinces on that the Liberals continued in the campaign to say they would maintain. Medical assistance in dying. That is something that the government started out with in 2015, and it's something they are going to again have to start out with in 2019. You may recall the first day of the election campaign, a Quebec Superior Court, I believe it was, struck down some components of that legislation, and the Prime Minister during the campaign indicated that that legislation indeed needs to evolve, and it's going to be a really interesting one to see work through a minority government, and again through the Senate, because they will have to expand the flexible definition to allow Canadians to have access to medical assistance in dying, as per the court's decision. Medical cannabis and, of course, cannabis legalization generally was part of their record, and that will continue to evolve because medical cannabis will have to undergo a review in the next 2 years based on the legislation that was passed 2 years ago. Opioids was a strong focus of the government by necessity because of what was being faced and continues to be faced throughout the country, and I would expect that to continue to come up. And pharmaceutical drugs was a strong focus of the first mandate of the government, so that is regulating the price of drugs in a manner that governments haven't necessarily done before, joining the PCPA to join up with provinces for bulk purchasing. And all of those things kind of lead to what perhaps has been an unfulfilled commitment or what was in the platform. A couple things they didn't get done. Nutrition policy, they had commitments on front of package labeling, amongst other things that weren't done, despite the food guide being something that was done. Pan-Canadian Health Reorganization, that was PG4A and Dr. Danielle Martin coming out and talking about how they can reorganize the federally funded agencies that support provincial priorities. So that's the CADTHs of the world, the Drugs and Substances Agency of the world. All of these organizations, they recommended to be reorged, and some of them indeed shut down. So that's a report that's kind of sitting on the shelf, and I believe Leslie Thompson from Accreditation Canada was leading a panel to review what the original panel had done. So there was a panel on a panel, I guess. Self-care products initiative. So that's the government regulating how items can be labeled on shelves. So say, a topical cream that could have a therapeutic benefit. What's the review or clinical trials that need to be done in order for that to be on a shelf? That is one of those sleeper regulatory issues that will really crop up because it impacts so many consumer products on the shelves. And then the last thing they didn't necessarily get done, though I think it would be up for debate, is they had a panel on implementing pharmacare, and pharmacare isn't yet implemented. So that kind of gets to where the government will probably have to go in the next couple of years based on the Liberal platform over this past election. So $6 billion in new commitments. My understanding that this is a down payment, not the total cost of these things. Pharmacare. So how is the government going to move forward now? Now that they're in a position of being in government again, they have to put some definition to that. And what is the definition that they're going to do? Is it single payer? Is it not? Based on the Liberal platform and the background of the platform, it looked like, and also based on when the Prime Minister answered a question after the debate regarding pharmacare, it looked like they were using the Hoskins report as recommendations that they would put to the provinces and territories, and they're going to put it in the court of the provinces and territories to say what they think pharmacare should be, since it's in the jurisdiction of provinces and territories, and that they would use funding transfers to support them. That's kind of the sense that you get based on the Prime Minister's comments and what was in the Liberal platform. But of course, they have to get a budget through the House, and the budget through the House needs to be supported by another party. So what pharmacare will look like will be interesting to see. Some areas of the country continue to have access problems when it comes to Canadians looking for family doctors. The Liberals want to transfer funding for that. In the platform, they indicated that they want to have national standards for mental health. There wasn't much more said about that other than that piece being in the platform. So I think we will all look forward to seeing exactly what that would look like. And then, as I mentioned before, they are going to continue their investments to home and palliative care. That latter piece will become more important, especially as they have to continue to address medical assistance in dying in the legislation. And there was a private member's bill actually last session calling for national standards on palliative care, and there was a consultation on that, so expect that to continue. And then last, there's a commitment to put $500 million a year for drugs for rare diseases starting in 2022. And I would argue that this is probably one of the most important issues for provinces, because drugs for rare diseases are driving growth in drug budgets in provinces, and it will continue to drive growth because they are high-cost drugs. And it is difficult for provinces to ascertain the benefit of them versus the cost. So that is going to be an ongoing challenge for provinces, and I'm sure provinces will be happy to see the federal government kicking some funding their way for that. So, as I catch my breath, what does this all mean? Over the next couple of years, there will be a heavy focus on pharmacare when it comes to the healthcare agenda. It is probably the single largest item that does not currently have definition that will need definition. It will also be costly no matter what way you cut it, and you will need provincial or territorial support for it. On all those unfulfilled commitments, it will be a question of the government as to whether or not they're going to keep them or they're going to drop them. You know, the government might take a view that they're in a new mandate, so they're able to kind of put the past in the past, or will they take those unfulfilled commitments and continue moving them forward because they are the same government? That will be a question. When it comes to pharmaceutical drugs and pricing as it plays into pharmacare, there's 2 lawsuits in front of the government right now on the PMPRB regulations that were regulated right before the government dissolved and Parliament dissolved, and they went to an election. In a minority context, it's difficult to have tough files in front of the courts and in the media. How the government reacts to that pressure and where Canadians and where patient groups put themselves in that fight will be particularly interesting, and I think you'll see the government react based on how that plays out. And then the last thing is after an election where Jason Kenney campaigned in Ontario, where Justin Trudeau targeted heavily Doug Ford and tried to tap in to dissatisfaction of that government to hold Ontario to give the edge to the seat count, as Ian just described. All of those relationships will need to be smoothed over, protected, repaired, because the federal government, especially on health, can do little without their provincial and territorial counterparts. And then here, I'm going to flip it over to Joanne to walk through the opposition.
Thanks, Peter. So again, as mentioned, Andrew Scheer's Conservatives are now a strengthened opposition, official opposition. judging by how they played minority parliaments when they were in power. We assume that they will believe their role to be holding government to account. It is the official job of the official opposition. We are unlikely to see them support the government on economic, climate, social policy type issues, although it is worth noting that they would probably be the only party that would cooperate with the government on natural resource issues like pipelines. You heard very little on health policy coming from Andrew Scheer during the campaign. He did make a commitment for just over 1.5 billion for MRIs across the country, but other than that, was relatively silent on health policy. His general, the Conservatives' general viewpoint is not to interfere in provincial areas with sort of specifics, and so if money is tied to things, it will again be unlikely that the Conservatives would be super supportive of what the Liberals are putting forward. And then moving on to the other parties on the next slide. So the NDP has again lost, as we noted earlier, has lost the number of seats, has also lost being the third party and is now the fourth party, but also has an opportunity to be sort of the balance of power. And you hear a lot of conversation about the balance of power. And it should be noted that while many commentators are saying that the NDP has the balance of power, the Bloc arguably also has the balance of power, and also arguably the Conservatives have the balance of power, though they're much less likely to use it. The NDP is also not coming out of this election with influence in fewer areas of the country, losing seats and losing vote share across the country. They will be the least prepared to go into another election. And so there's a little bit more at stake for them to keep this minority parliament going. And they will not want to be viewed as supporting the Liberals on everything they do, because there is a tipping point there where it just becomes the argument of, if they're just going to support the Liberals, then why not just vote for the Liberals who are actually in power and have control? Of note, and opposite to the sort of Conservative view on health, and somewhere in the middle, I would argue, of the Liberal view on health, a lot of what Jagmeet Singh was talking about during the election were healthcare, but in a very local sense, and almost interfering in provincial areas of jurisdiction that he may not have been able to deliver on had he won, building hospitals in Brampton and opening emergency rooms in Manitoba, rather than on the more provincial-led files. So again, he's more likely, the Jagmeet Singh and the NDP is more likely to cooperate on health files with the Liberals, but it remains to be seen if the Liberals will go as far as he would like, or if Jagmeet will have the ability to move the Liberals to go further than they might have previously considered. And the other parties, so I think the title there is apt, that they will be fighting to make their mark. The Bloc will be is a growing force that it hasn't been in almost 20 years in Quebec. They will be pushing the Liberal government to give money and jurisdiction and more powers to the province, and less so to tie any of that funding to anything. They will want to do their own thing and have the province decide itself how that money is spent. It's worth noting that as the third party, they will gain a new prominence in question period and potentially at parliamentary committees. The Greens will again continue to have a voice, but will likely not have a huge amount of influence. As in the last parliament, they will have a limited share of question period. Committees will be negotiated, or the committee memberships will be negotiated over the next couple of weeks, but it's unlikely that they will be able to have a lot of influence there. And again, with the independent, with Jody Wilson-Raybould, it remains to be seen what committees, or if she gets a lot of time in the House, but it seems unlikely at this point in time.
Cool. So I think I was going to run through this one. What do we expect in the next month, 2 months? So the Prime Minister said yesterday that Cabinet will be appointed on November 20th, which is relatively similar to the timeline that happened in 2015. And then after that takes place, and there'll be a bunch of speculation in terms of who is going to be appointed to Cabinet. They have a couple Cabinet ministers they need to replace. Obviously, Rav Goodale and Minister Sohi will no longer be in Cabinet because they didn't retain their seats. And the PM will have to figure out where he gets his representation from Western Canada. So after that takes place, you will have a recall of Parliament. The PM indicated in his press conference yesterday that he has not put out a timeline for when that would take place. The first thing that happens after Parliament is recalled is that you have the selection of the Speaker. And after that vote takes place and the Speaker's in place, you have a speech from the throne. The speech from the throne will be the first confidence vote that the Liberal government will face in a minority context. I think it would be surprising if something happened. However, I do not think this is going to be a scenario that the government will fall. And I do think there will be a lot of coverage over who supports the Liberal government on that first confidence motion, because it's a momentous point in time. Within 10 days of Parliament being recalled, the Standing Committee on Procedure will need to report back to the House of Commons on committee membership and composition. And this, for a parliamentary nerd, is the most fascinating environment in a minority government. I experienced this provincially, and Joanne experienced this federally. Committees are incredibly difficult when you're a government in a minority situation because you no longer have control. And I don't think people really understand just how powerful committees are. They have the ability to compel witnesses, they have the ability to demand information of the government, and they have the ability to study whatever it is they wish to study. Interestingly, the composition of the committees will be a debate. Almost all committees except for 3 have 12 members, and there's 3 committees that have 11. I'll spare you the details, but if you want to have a nerdy conversation later, I'm more than happy to. Though how they come up with what party gets what is essentially a negotiation. It goes back to the House of Commons to be supported. So how many votes the Liberal get in a minority government is up for debate, but the standing orders do point to the fact that the committee composition needs to be proportional to the House of Commons composition. What this will mean, and Joanne just spoke to it, is that the NDP is going to have a reduced voice on committee, and the Bloc Québécois will have an increased voice on committee because they are the third party. And it's unlikely that both the Greens or Jody Wilson-Raybould will have a voting role on committee. However, any MP can attend a committee meeting. So after those committees get up and running, we'll probably see some potential studies come up, whether or not they'll get passed to be studied, like say on SNC or otherwise. It'll be interesting to see if the Bloc Québécois supports something like that. We'll head into the speech from the throne. And because we'll have the committees kicked off, the Finance Committee will be able to start their budget consultation. That's going to be something of interest to a lot of people on this webinar. And then the government will also separately and have their own distinct consultation process on Budget 2020. And we'll be off and rolling on that process that will take us into 2020. Joanne, I can't remember. Did you want to run through this slide here?
Sure.
Yeah.
So again, we've heard the Prime Minister now say that he will not entertain a formal coalition. So this will be reminiscent of the minorities we've seen over the last couple of decades, both in Ontario and federally. This is an opportunity for other parties and certainly for stakeholders to seek support on an initiative by initiative basis. And again, we talk a lot about the NDP holding the balance of power, but there's other parties where there are opportunities to hold the balance of power on specific issues. There's a bit less predictability in a minority, especially without a coalition. There's also, because there's sort of an election always around the corner, we suspect this minority will last a couple of years. There, as you see in the media at times, and federal MPs get their pensions after 6 years of service. So for the large number of new MPs elected in 2015, that 6-year mark comes up in 2021. And with MPs having greater influence on votes and how things happen in the House, not that I'm saying MPs do things because they get a pension, because they certainly don't, but it is a consideration that will be in the minds of some folks. When you consider timing, we would expect this to last for those couple of years, but arguably not a whole lot longer than that. And continuing on a similar slide we presented in the last webinar, the challenges and opportunities, and some of which we've covered. The challenges, of course, is that parties continue to be in campaign mode with lots of rhetoric and lots of posturing. The bureaucracy becomes arguably a little bit more powerful. Decisions are less likely to be made in sort of in the PMO. MPs will have a little bit more power, which is both a challenge and an opportunity. The bureaucracy will be busy, but will also always be sort of ready to take on that sort of caretaker role if an election rolls up soon. And governments will have trouble with sustained negative attention. So a new scandal, or a scandal like the SNC-Lavalin scandal, still allowed the majority Liberal government to pass its agenda, but it will be tougher if there are scandals or sustained negative attention on the government. It will be more difficult for other parties to support that, which I think is both a challenge and an opportunity. And on the opportunity side, stakeholder concerns will definitely have more profile. MPs are more concerned with what's happening at home. They're less able to travel. They want to spend more time in their ridings. The House of Commons becomes a place where people need to be more often. A government is very sensitive to the media cycle, so anything in the public domain that is either a win or a loss is an opportunity. Short-term political wins are a priority in a minority parliament. So if there's something that a stakeholder has that could deliver a win, it would certainly be helpful. And as I think we've all hinted at earlier, parliamentary committees are definitely more powerful in this circumstance, and so again, there's an opportunity there in reaching out to individual MPs, not just having all the decisions made from a central perspective.
This kind of brings us to our final thoughts, and then we'll open it up for questions. And just so you know how to ask questions, you scroll to the bottom, and I think there's a place where you can raise your hand, essentially. And then I can unmute you if you want. So or just write it into the chat section if you have a question. our kind of final thoughts. My gut and our gut is that this government's going to want to move fast. They're going to want to move fast because, you know, it's easy to take a majority government for granted. It is hard to learn how to government in the first 2 years, learn the federal system, learn the bureaucracy, the process. You have a government that has found its groove because they have been in government, so they have the ability to move faster. And then by necessity, because they're in a minority environment, they need to show that they are competent managers and that they can do the job, so that they do, if they do find themselves in an election, they can show that they have the ability to earn back the trust of a majority government from the population. And similarly so, the opposition's job is to prove the opposite, and they will use every tool possible and all the additional powers they will have in a minority context to make that point loud and clear to Canadians. The Liberal government will be challenged, as have Liberal governments in the past been challenged, to show that they can represent the country as a whole. When we started out the slide, it's always fun going back to previous elections, and there are a number of examples where arguably the Liberals won government based on solid support in the East, and they did not have a significant support in the West. And then, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, the really unique thing is that they have literally no seats in some provinces, which will be a challenge. And as Joanne talked about, the government has to change. And I think the remarks that we saw from the Prime Minister yesterday was the beginning of that reframing. They will have to, by necessity, be more responsive to public angst, stakeholder concern, what you see in the media, because the tolerance for bad news cycles, the tolerance for not responding to stakeholders of the public will only be as much as the opposition parties allow for. And you could imagine their tolerance is not going to be very high, and they will look to capitalize on any mistakes the Liberals make. Politically speaking, in 2020, I believe all the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP all will be undergoing leadership reviews. From an inside baseball perspective, the leadership reviews sometimes are not meaningful at all. I would actually say most of the time not, because people want to show support for the party. But they have had some interesting blips in the impact of them. Joe Clark, you'll remember that many years ago. Tom Mulcair, just a couple of years ago, didn't receive 50% support. I think the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, they're going to have some work to do ahead of them to calm and win back support of their party in some areas of the country, notably Ontario and Quebec, where they either were decimated or they did not see any breakthroughs. I think the Liberals will have to make sure that they're going back on their base, because Prime Minister Trudeau just isn't as popular as he was 4 years ago, and has had his own missteps that he has to overcome. And then regardless of Andrew Scheer doing better than he did, than Stephen Harper did in 2015, there will always be internal questions about a leader. Whether or not I think it will result in anything for Prime Minister Trudeau and Andrew Scheer, I don't think so. I think Jagmeet Singh will probably have the hardest go of it when it comes to leadership reviews. And then last but not least, the government will first and foremost be about survival. It's going to be on a vote-by-vote basis. They're going to be really preoccupied of that. The House Leader immediately becomes a very senior minister of the government, who will help maintain the government agenda and help the government survive. And I think as you go in for meetings and you ask, ministers to visit you, you're going to have a harder and harder time getting them outside of Ottawa, because there's usually an edict that goes in place that when the House is sitting, you have to be within 5 minutes of the House of Commons at all times. So with that, we will pause. Ian and Joanne might have some final comments, and why don't I kind of open it up? And again, if you want to ask a question, you click on chat and you just type it in there, and that's how you can ask a question if you wish. And if there are no questions, that's okay. But we want to make sure there's the opportunity. First question, I'm sure everybody can see it, but who do you think the Liberal government is likely to go into a coalition with? And what do we think the impact on the healthcare agenda? What do we think the impact will be on the healthcare agenda? So good question. I'll quickly do a quick answer and then I'll open it up to my colleagues if they have something else. So the Prime Minister said that he's not going to enter into a coalition. So that means that every vote will be determined who will support the Liberal government on each vote. And I think the thinking there would be there might be some issues that the NDP could support the Liberals on, but I don't think they're ruling out that other parties might support their government on different initiatives. There might be a scenario, and Joanne can probably hit on that, like what scenario the Conservatives might support, and there might be scenarios that the Bloc might support. I think it's assumed that the NDP has more in common than the Liberals than the other, but I think the Liberals want to maintain control of their agenda by going on a vote-by-vote basis rather than having to negotiate and potentially giving up some of their agenda by entering into a formal coalition. And then on the healthcare agenda, I do think that, say when it comes to budget conversations and they're looking for a party to support them on the budget, and if they're negotiating for the NDP to support them on the budget, all you have to do is look at the NDP platform, and it's likely that the Liberals will really have to double down and show that they're serious about implementing pharmacare and what that program might mean. The NDP is in favor of a single payer system. The Liberals haven't said that they're in favor of that. That would be a good big question mark in terms of what does pharmacare look like and what does NDP want to see in order to support the budget. I don't know, Joanne, do you have any comments generally on that one from the Conservative perspective?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is I think it's on health and social issues. I think it's unlikely that the Conservatives would support the Liberal platform as written or things in it as written. But that said, if the sort of language from Prime Minister Trudeau about taking ideas to the provinces and letting the provinces decide, or at least having them be part of the conversation, and any initiatives if for example pharmacare was just each province gets X amount of money to do what they want with pharmacare. I think that the Bloc would be interested in that. I think the NDP would not necessarily be interested in that, and I think the Tories would be hard pressed to explain why they wouldn't vote for it. So it is a little bit of an issue by issue thing, but I do think that anything that gives provinces more prevalence will be certainly of issue to the Bloc, and anything that is more sweeping national, especially spending programs, would definitely be more interesting to the NDP.
Another question came in asking if we heard where the government might move on vaping. And I think this is a good question from a couple perspectives. One, I would argue that the one thing when it came to health, I think as people who are concerned about health and focus on health policy, and I'm sure many on this call would probably agree that there was probably not enough time spent on health. However, my expectation is that the parties spent a day each talking about it, as they probably did talking about most of their policy planks. And then there are some things that they're talking about more, some parties talk about climate change. So I'm not surprised that they didn't talk about it that much, but I'm specifically surprised that there wasn't much talk about public health, given how much the opioids crisis has been dominating the news cycle over the past couple of years, that we didn't necessarily hear more on that. Given that during the campaign, there was a lot of attention on the safety of vaping and potential issues when it comes to vaping, surprised there wasn't much on that. The last thing that I would say on vaping, though, is that there's going to be a really interesting debate in the government, I would suspect, on the difference between tobacco vapes and cannabis vapes. And as you may know, edibles and various products were approved legally on October 17th, but it's not until December that things will go on the shelves. So it will be interesting to see if the government will allow cannabis vapes in stores for consumers when the list of final products that LPs are allowed selling comes out in December. But I think vaping is going to carry on. Ian just was writing a note next to me here, flagging when vaping was in the media. It was also when Trudeau was apologizing for his previous black and brown face incidents. So the election media was dominated on that at the same time as vaping going on. So that might also explain that there was just a bit of oversaturation when that was going on as well too. Are there any other questions? Thoughts on how the leadership review for Elizabeth May will go? I don't know, thoughts on that?
I mean, from my perspective, I think at the beginning of the campaign, the polling was predicting that the Greens would pick up a little bit more seats than, they came out with in the end. I think even some polls had them at 7 or 8 seats at various times. And so that would have been, if that had come to fruition, significant gains for Elizabeth May and her party. Of course, they only ended up gaining 1 additional seat. So it was a bit of a letdown on that side. My personal opinion, I don't know if, given where the Green Party is at, that would be considered such a devastating failure or loss to call into question her leadership. Like, I personally don't think that given the kind of the situation that the Green Party is in, with growth, that would necessarily impact her leadership specifically. I do think the challenge for them going forward is that the results of this election showed that you need a credible plan, in my opinion, that you need a credible plan on climate change, that came out from voters, I think, pretty loud and clear, although I'm sure there's various opinions on that. So I think they might have a bit of a challenge now going forward in kind of how do you differentiate yourself from other parties who are putting forward plans when you're traditionally have been a one-issue party, but it will be interesting to see.
I think the bigger question is whether or not Elizabeth May wants to continue on being leader. You will recall seeing some articles that she was actually, after the last election, she was devastated that they didn't have a breakthrough, and she was considering whether or not she would even run this time as leader. And you got to remember, she's been leader of the Green Party since 2006, and it's probably a debate within the Green Party that they want to be branded as the Green Party, not the Elizabeth May Party. So on one hand, you will have that conversation in terms of what does the Green Party stand for and what are we, what is our brand? And then on the other, you will probably have a personal reflection on Elizabeth May's part that she's been leader for 13 years, and is it something she wants to continue doing? Any other final questions? Comments on a province voting red and Conservative provincial. Joanne, do you want to hit this one off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this is pretty typical of, if speaking from an Ontario perspective, I think it's pretty typical that the provinces and the federal government is opposite. I think there's a long history of that in Ontario, and I think it's a little bit of voters hedging their bets and having one party that focuses on the economy and one that focuses on more progressive issues. And so, again, I think it's a traditional thing and has flipped for a number of years.
Any final comments? We'll do a quick last call. Thanks everybody for joining in lieu of any other questions coming in. I think Ian, Joanne, and I thoroughly enjoy being able to do these. We did one mid-campaign, one after. If there are other things that you're curious about and you think would be a good discussion, please let us know. And I would also, at any point, offer you to reach out and continue the conversation with any one of us. If you don't know how to get a hold of us, you can find us on our website and our information there. And I would generally just say thanks for joining and hope you have a good day, and we'll be curious to see where this minority government takes us over the next couple of weeks.